What index is used to judge morally permissible, justified actions by, and what is the role of law in societal ethical enforcement? First, let's get clear on some terms. Ethical behavior. Acting in accordance with moral principles and values that are considered right by society or a specific group, such as honesty, fairness, and respect, often going beyond just legal requirements. Moral permissibility refers to the status of an action being acceptable or allowable within a moral framework. It plays a crucial role in ethical theories, determining whether specific actions can be justified without violating moral principles. This concept is particularly significant when evaluating the implications of various ethical theories and their respective critiques, especially when weighing the outcomes against moral duties. Example: choosing to donate to charity is morally permissible. It is good but not required. Morally justified: an action, situation, or belief is considered acceptable, right, or reasonable from an ethical standpoint because there is a good reason for it, even if the action itself has negative implications. It's the process of providing a rationale that aligns an action with principles of justice, welfare, and rights, often by framing it as serving a greater good or preventing a greater harm. Example: breaking a promise to save someone's life might be morally justified, even though promise breaking is generally wrong. Modal ethics, legal design, and finding morally justifiable or permissible. An explanatory framework. This model explores how laws should be crafted and enforced when the morality of an act is uncertain and when enforcement itself carries social consequences. It's built on 3 interlocking principles. Moral certainty spectrum. Not all acts are clearly moral or immoral. Some fall into gray zones, ambiguous, context-dependent, or contested. High moral certainty, for example, exploitation and coercion. These acts justify legal intervention, especially when the harm is clear and preventable. Low moral certainty, for example, symbolic protest or unconventional behavior. These acts require caution. Imposing law here risks punishing ambiguity and suppressing moral diversity. The law must recognize that uncertainty in morality is not a flaw, it is a feature of pluralistic societies. 2. Entailment ethics. Laws don't just prohibit or permit, they entail consequences. These consequences can be social, psychological, economic, or symbolic. Model emphasize minimal invasiveness. Laws should interfere as little as possible with personal agency and communal trust. Entailment severity. If enforcing a law causes more harm than the act itself, for example, mass incarceration for minor offenses, it may be more immoral in aggregate. Preventive value. Laws should be judged by how effectively they prevent harm, not just how clearly they express moral condemnation. This shifts legal reasoning from moral absolutism to modal pragmatism. What does the law do, not just what does it say? 3. Social contract resolution. Rather than imposing morality from above, laws should emerge from direct party outcomes, what the affected individuals and communities agree upon as just, constructive, and livable. Consent-based design. Laws should reflect the values and needs of those most impacted. Survivor-centered reasoning. Legal frameworks must prioritize those who bear the brunt of both the act and its enforcement. World-building orientation. Law is not just reactive, it is aspirational. It helps construct the kind of world we wish to inhabit. This principle reframes law as a collaborative moral architecture, not a coercive moral weapon. Summary: how the modal framework works. Dimension guiding principle. Moral certainty. Enforce clearly immoral acts. Be skeptical of ambiguous ones. Entailment ethics minimize harm from enforcement. Weigh social cost against preventive value. Social contract design laws through direct stakeholder outcomes and aspirational communal reasoning. Morally permissible. An action is morally permissible when it is allowed within a moral system. It is not morally wrong, even if it is not morally required. It may be neutral, optional, or acceptable without needing strong justification. A world worth living in, a moral barometer core principle. Would this action, if allowed, help build a world that most people across cultures, vulnerabilities, and roles would feel safe, respected, and free to flourish in? Would this align with a coherent corresponding consensus and pragmatic reality? What this barometer captures. Relational ethics. It centers not just the agent, but the impact on others, especially those most affected. Survivor-centered logic. It asks whether those harmed or marginalized would still choose to live in such a world. Cumulative impact. It considers how repeated permission shapes norms, expectations, and thresholds. Consent and trust. It foregrounds whether people can trust the rules to protect their dignity and autonomy. Core strengths of the modal ethics legal design framework. Moral certainty spectrum, embracing ambiguity as a civic asset. Why it matters. Most legal systems struggle with acts that fall into moral gray zones. This model doesn't treat ambiguity as a failure, it treats it as a feature of pluralistic societies. Operational clarity. High certainty acts, for example coercion, justify intervention. Low certainty acts, for example symbolic protest, require restraint. MOTS. Narrative power. It reframes law not as a moral enforcer, but as a moral listener attuned to context, dissent, and diversity. 2. Entailment ethics. Law as a system of consequences, not just commands. Why it matters. Enforcement itself can be harmful. This principle foregrounds the ripple effects, social, psychological, economic, of legal action. Operational clarity. Laws must be minimally invasive. Enforcement must not cause more harm than the act. Preventive value must outweigh expressive condemnation. Narrative power. It shifts legal reasoning from moral absolutism to modal pragmatism. What does the law do? Not just what does it say. 3. Social contract resolution, law as collaborative moral architecture. Why it matters. Top-down morality often alienates the very communities it claims to protect. This principle centers consent, survivor experience, and aspirational design. Operational clarity. Laws should reflect the values of those most impacted. Survivor-centered reasoning is non-negotiable. Law is a tool for world-building, not just rule enforcement. Narrative power. It transforms law into a co-authored story of communal flourishing. Justification versus permission, a useful ethical distinction. Morally justified requires strong ethical reasoning, often involves norm violation for greater good. Morally permissible, ethically acceptable, but not obligatory, neutral, or optional within a moral system. This distinction is crucial for designing laws that don't conflate moral heroism with legal obligation. Chapter Truth under Perfect Access. In moral philosophy, the notion of truth under perfect access refers to an idealized condition in which all relevant variables, intent, context, consequence, are fully visible and knowable. Under such conditions, moral judgments could be rendered with precision, and universal principles could be applied without distortion. The assumption is that with complete information, ethical reasoning becomes both coherent and just. This ideal, however, is rarely if ever realized. In practice, intent is often opaque. Individuals may act from motives that are concealed, conflicted, or inaccessible to observers. Contexts are partial, shaped by histories, traumas, and social structures that resist full articulation. Consequences unfold in nonlinear ways, influenced by systems beyond the scope of any single agent's control. The gap between ideal access and real-world opacity introduces a fundamental challenge to moral universalism. When intent cannot be reliably known, the application of universal truths risks misattribution, injustice, or harm. A belief that appears just in abstraction may produce unjust outcomes when scaled across diverse and complex realities. One proposed response to this challenge is a shift from action-based evaluation to systemic consequence testing. Rather than asking whether a belief is universally true in principle, one might ask, would I want to live in a world where this belief was held by all? This reframing does not eliminate the need for moral reasoning, but it relocates it, from the individual act to the collective architecture it implies. Such an approach acknowledges the limitations of epistemic access while preserving the aspiration toward justice. It treats moral beliefs not as isolated imperatives but as components of world-building. In doing so, it invites a form of ethical design that is resilient to ambiguity, responsive to plural experience, and oriented toward sustaining dignity even when full understanding is not possible. Situation 1. A criminal trial involving self-defense. Under perfect access. The court knows exactly what the defendant intended. All contextual factors, threat level, prior trauma, fear, timing, are fully visible. The consequences of the act are predictable and morally traceable. Verdicts can be rendered with confidence and justice feels clean. In reality, intent is contested. The defendant claims fear. The prosecution claims aggression. Context is partial. Surveillance footage shows movement but not emotion. Prior abuse is undocumented. Consequences are tragic and irreversible. The legal system must decide based on incomplete access, risking misjudgment. Index worldview application. Instead of asking, was this act justified, in isolation, we ask, would we want to live in a world where this standard of self-defense, given opacity of intent, was applied to all? This reframing tests the belief not just for coherence, but for systemic justice. Does it protect the vulnerable, allow for ambiguity, and prevent misuse? Situation 2. A friend cancels plans repeatedly. Under perfect access. You know their exact intent. They are overwhelmed, not avoiding you. Their context is clear: work stress, mental health, family obligations. You respond with compassion, knowing the cancellation isn't personal. In reality, intent is unclear. Are they pulling away? Are you being neglected? Context is partial. They do not explain, and you are left guessing. Your response risks being either too harsh or too accommodating. Index worldview application. Instead of asking, is this behavior acceptable, you ask, would I want to live in a world where this kind of ambiguity in friendship is met with this kind of response? This allows for a relational ethic, one that balances boundaries with empathy and builds norms that sustain trust even when clarity is missing.